Colorado, 1888. Winter is coming down from the mountains. A black ridgeline under a slate-gray sky. One cabin at the edge of it all. A frozen yard. A woman splitting wood alone, every swing clean, unhurried, certain.
Her face. No tears. Only eyes that read the sky the way a general reads a battlefield. On the table inside, a paper stamped in red.
Far up the canyon road, a man on a fine horse is riding down. Leather folio pressed to his chest.
Hooves striking iron-hard ground. Soft hands. Clean paper. A name about to be drawn.
The canyon held its cold the way a miser holds money close, deliberate, unwilling to release even a degree before the mountain decided the season had earned it. In Jasper Gulch, Colorado, the sun cleared the eastern ridge late and vanished behind the western wall early, leaving the north-facing slope in a blue shadow that lasted most of the day from October through April. The people who lived there had learned to read that shadow the way sailors read water, to understand what it meant about what was coming, to make their peace with what it promised. On the morning of the 14th of October, 1888, a woman stood in a frozen yard outside Company House number 11 with an axe in her hands. She had been at it since before the light came over the ridge, working by feel and instinct in the gray pre-dawn, and the stack beside the chopping block had grown to a height that would have made a stronger man proud. Each swing came down clean, the wood surrendering in two equal halves that fell to either side without drama, without waste. She set the next log, swung, set another. Her breath plumed white in the still air. She did not look up when the sound of hooves reached her from the road below. Rowena Marsh was 39 years old, dark-haired, her face weathered in the specific way of women who have spent their lives at altitude, where the sun is harsher and the winters longer than anywhere a reasonable person would choose to live. She had come to Jasper Gulch 7 years earlier as the wife of Silas Marsh, who had taken work at the Ironback mine because the pay was steady and the company promised housing, and she had made the cabin behind her into something that deserved the word home through the accumulation of 1,000 small efforts, the curtain she had sewn, the shelf her husband had built for the few things that mattered to her, the braided rug that had been her mother's and now covered the worst of the floorboards. She had made it home. The paper on the table inside had told her, in the flat language of men who write such things for a living, that she had until the 1st of November to make it someone else's. Silas had been dead for 7 weeks. She had read the notice 3 times the morning it arrived, not because the words confused her, but because she kept searching for the place where a human being had been permitted to enter the sentence. There was none. The document concerned itself with occupancy and regulation and the practical matter of a residence required for an incoming replacement. It did not mention that the man whose number the new tenant would inherit had spent 12 years going down into the earth before dawn and coming back up after dark. It did not mention the $12 in silver that represented everything left after the company settled Silas's outstanding account at the store against his final wages. A man's entire working life in this canyon, and the ledger closed with a number that wouldn't buy passage to the next town in winter. The paper had been stamped in red. The stamp was the color of old blood, pressed so deep into the fiber that even the back of the page carried its bruise. She had smoothed it flat on the pine table with 2 fingers, the way you might try to reason with something unreasonable, then set the axe against the chopping block and begun the day's work. There was firewood to cut. The work was real in a way the paper was not, or at least in a way she could answer with her body. A dog sat at the edge of the woodpile watching the rutted road that bent down toward the Ironback's headframe. His name was Soot, and he was a brindle and white animal of no particular breed, heavy through the chest, with eyes the color of creek water over dark stone. He had taken up his post at the edge of the yard and sometime in the weeks after Silas's death, and held it with a patience that belonged more to a sentry than a dog. He did not watch her work. He watched the road. She had stopped correcting him. A dog that watches a road has reasons, and she had learned through a hard autumn to trust reasons she could not name. The hooves she had been hearing belonged to a gray horse too fine for the practical purposes of a mining district, and the man who rode it dismounted at the yard gate without greeting her. Gilbert Crane was the regional agent for Stanton and Vale Consolidated, the company that owned the mine, the houses, the store. the credit, the road, and by extension the lives of every family in Jasper Gulch. He was a soft man, thickened through the middle from years, in a heated office, his hands smooth in the way that comes from handling paper rather than tools. He carried his leather folio against his chest, with the unconscious reverence of a decaying scripture, as though the documents inside were the truest things in the world, which for the purposes of his working life they were. He walked across the yard without looking at the woodpile. He did not see the hours of labor it represented, or perhaps he saw it the way one sees weather present, unremarkable, of no particular significance to the business at hand. He entered the cabin as though he already held the deed in his coat pocket, which in every way the company recognized he did. She followed him in. He had set the folio on the pine table, the table Silas had built from rough planks across 3 winter evenings, bending and planing and rubbing it smooth with a block of beeswax until the grain ran like dark water under the surface. Crane's clean finger tapped a line on the document he had opened there. The 1st of November. His voice carried no malice, which was somehow more complete than malice would have been. Malice at least acknowledges that a person is standing across from it, that there is someone whose reaction is worth anticipating. What Crane offered was the administrative courtesy of a man reading a figure off a ledger page. A figure doesn't need to be treated with any particular care. It only needs to be processed correctly. The company requires the house. Where am I to go, Mr. Crane? Not a plea she had decided before he arrived that she would not plead. A request for information that a man with a folio ought to be able to provide. He closed the document with a soft, final sound. There was a mission in Delwood, the nearest town, 7 miles down the canyon road, perhaps a boarding house further south, in one of the larger settlements, places that accommodated women in her situation. His eyes moved across the room while he said this, tallying it with a practiced efficiency: the quilt, the shelf, the braided rug, the cold iron stove, all of it company property, he reminded her. Forfeit against the outstanding balance on Silas' store account, the boots he had bought on credit, the lamp oil, the powder, the small debts a working man carries forward from one pay period to the next, never imagining that a rockfall would close the account before he could clear it. He was on his way to the door when he offered the final piece. The first snow, he said, would accomplish what she seemed unwilling to accomplish herself. There was in the saying of it a small dry satisfaction, the tone of a man who serves as the instrument of something larger than himself and finds comfort in the arrangement. She listened to the hooves recede down the frozen road. She stood at the window for a time with her hand resting on the sill, feeling the cold that came through the glass. Then she went back outside and kept splitting wood, because that was the kind of answer she could make with her body. Word of her refusals spread through Jasper Gulch before the week was out, traveling the specific routes that travels in small towns from the company's store, where Huggins the ledger keeper heard things he was not supposed to repeat, to the parlors where women gathered to sew, to the long bar of the single saloon where men who had worked beside Silas Marsh now found reasons to study their glasses when certain subjects were raised. Huggins had drunk with Silas for 5 winters running. He had once helped carry the man home through a January snowstorm, both of them laughing at nothing, the cold making everything funnier than it was. He could no longer raise his eyes to Rowena's across the counter. This was not cruelty in him. It was arithmetic. Every family in Jasper Gulch existed on a page in Stanton and Vale's ledger, and to be seen standing too close to a woman whose page had been formally closed was to risk a notation against your own. When the hard season came, and this year, the old men were saying the hard season would be harder than anything in recent memory, the difference between a sack of flour advanced on credit and a sack of flour refused could be the difference between a family that made it through and a family that did not. The men who had carried Silas down from the rockfall on a door laid across 2 saddle frames, who had stood with their hats in their hands, while the company chaplain read the words in a voice the wind kept trying to steal, they now found reasons to study the boardwalk planks when she passed. They were not bad men. They were beholden men, and a beholden man learns early to calibrate his kindnesses against his debts. Dorothea Vane was the wife of the town's only minister, a woman of strong opinions and considerable social influence, which she exercised primarily in the warm parlors, where the respectable women of Jasper Gulch gathered twice weekly to sew and to settle the moral accounts of their neighbors. She had begun to speak of Rowena in those rooms not with venom, because venom required a kind of passion she was too composed to indulge, but with the particular regret of a woman who has seen a cautionary tale developing and feels a duty to make sure others see it too. The widow Marsh, she confided over her needle, was making things difficult for everyone, refusing to bow to a reality that bowed for no one, setting herself above the arrangements by which the rest of them lived without complaint. She was not a wicked woman, Dorothea was careful to say this, because she was not interested in cruelty, only in accuracy. She was a woman grief had made stubborn, which was its own kind of tragedy, and the winter would resolve it as the winter resolved most things in a canyon like this one. Dorothea was not a wicked woman. She was a frightened one, married to a man whose theology offered more comfort about the world to come than he had ever managed to secure in this one, and frightened people require solid ground to stand on. A widow with no credit and no prospects made a serviceable floor. Amos Pfeiffer heard all of it and said nothing in public. He was a carpenter by trade who had spent 2 years working the timber sets beside Silas Marsh in the lower drifts of the Ironback, bracing the dark together, shoulder to shoulder, trusting his life to the other man's judgment about where the load in a beam was running and when a set needed replacing before it failed. You learn things about a man in conditions like that, things that could not be learned any other way. What Amos knew, and what he carried quietly because there was no safe way to say it aloud, was that a man like Silas Marsh did not die by accident, not from inattention, not from the kind of carelessness that the company's written account of the incident implied. Silas had checked his bracing 3 times where another man checked it once, had a feel for the load in a beam, the way a doctor has a feel for a fever, the way the body recognizes something wrong before the mind has found the words for it. A man with that particular gift did not stand under bad timber by accident. He watched Rowena pass beneath his window one gray afternoon, her shoulder squared into a wind that bent younger people sideways, her chin level. The want to do something useful and concrete rose in him the way heat rises off a stove. His wife Ruth caught the direction of his gaze. She was not a hard woman, but she was a practical one. "We have children," she said, her voice quiet and not unkind, carrying underneath it something older than their marriage, older than the town. "We have our own page in that book." Amos let the curtain fall. Whatever he might have done died in the warm air of his own kitchen, a small failure of nerve he would carry through the autumn and into the worst winter of his life, where it would wait for him with the patience of debt. So Jasper Gulch watched Rowena Marsh from behind its glass and made its collective peace with how her story ended. The consensus was not cruel exactly, it was the practiced comfort of people who have learned to absorb hard facts without being destroyed by them. She was stubborn. She was touched by grief in a way that prevented clear thinking. The first serious blizzard would do what the canyon's winters always did to people who refused to accept their situation, and the community would note her absence with appropriate solemnity and move forward, because that was what communities in places like this one did. What the town did not see, because it had decided before looking that there was nothing worth seeing, was that the widow was not waiting. She was measuring. Every morning she walked the length of the yard and noted the angle at which the sun cut across the canyon floor, shorter each day, the light retreating up the south-facing wall as October deepened. She read the direction of the wind off the high peaks the way Silas had taught her in the days before the mind ground the walking out of him on the long Sunday afternoons when they would go up above the timber line, and he would show her things he had learned from men who had learned them from men before the color of the clouds, when moisture was moving in from the northwest, the particular smell the air took on 12 hours before a serious front. She watched the squirrels working the pine slopes above the canyon with an urgency that went beyond ordinary autumn preparation, their coats thicker than she had seen in previous years, their caching frantic. The hornets' nests in the timber stood higher than usual, which the old-timers said meant the snow line would be lower. What she read in all of it agreed with the almanac that passed hand to hand through the store, the one that the men who could do the math read twice and then put down without discussing. The cold this year would be exceptional. The snows would come before November was finished, and they would stay, and the cold that followed would be of a kind that tested not just the poorly prepared but the carefully prepared, not just the foolish but the merely unlucky. She understood something that she had not fully let herself understand before. The 60 days that Crane had offered her, the mercy he had extended in place of the regulations 30, the generosity he had clearly expected her to thank him for, landed her without a roof at the precise moment when being without a roof in this canyon crossed the line from hardship to death sentence. Crane read freight schedules and weather reports. He corresponded with lowland offices that had telegraph access to meteorological services. He knew what was coming down that canyon with the same certainty that she knew it from reading the squirrels' coats. The mercy he had extended was a sentence dressed in the costume of grace, and whether he had intended the cruelty or simply failed to notice it made no difference to the woman standing at the bottom of the calendar. More than the sun or the almanac or the squirrels, she watched Soot. The dog had begun his strange ritual sometime in the 3rd week after Silas died. Each morning before the light came over the eastern ridge, before she had the stove going, before she had so much as pulled on her boots, Soot was up and at the door, insistent, pressing his nose into whatever gap he could find between the door and the frame. She would let him out, and he would go, trotting with purpose up the north slope of the canyon to a barren shoulder of ground that no one in Jasper Gulch had ever found a use for. Not for grazing, because the slope was wrong and the soil was mostly rock. Not for timber, because the trees there were juniper, stunted and twisted by the elevation. Not for anything a person could sell or eat or build with, and there Soot dug. He dug at the frozen ground with a focused, almost professional intensity, his paws working the iron earth until they split and bled, leaving small dark prints in the frost on his way back down. When he could dig no more, he lay down beside the place and fixed his eyes on it with the expression of a creature waiting for something to happen. The same place. Every morning before the dawn, she had called him back at first, certain it was some animal instinct chasing the memory of a buried cache or the ghost of a marmot. But an instinct doesn't drive a dog to bleed his own feet day after day in deepening cold. An instinct runs its course and moves on. Soot's certainty did not waver or shift. It only intensified. By the 3rd week, she stopped calling and started watching. She began noting the precise location on the slope, the way the light hit it at different hours, the specific juniper beside which the dog always positioned himself when he lay down to wait. She began to think about what thinking like Silas would look like, not what she felt about the slope, but what she could observe about it, what was true about it that she had not yet bothered to measure. Thinking was the most dangerous thing a dismissed woman could do in a town like this one. It was the one thing that no company regulation had ever found a way to prevent. She climbed the slope one cold afternoon, leaving the half-split wood behind, telling herself she was only going to see what she could see. The climb took less than 10 minutes. The slope was steeper than it looked from below, the ground treacherous with frost-killed grass that hid loose rock, and by the time she reached the spot where Soot always positioned himself, she was breathing with effort and her hands were cold inside her gloves. There was nothing to see that a passing stranger would have paused for. A surveyor would have marked nothing of value. The ground was scree and frozen earth, the juniper beside it, gray-barked and half-dead, its roots lifting from the soil in the way of trees that have given up arguing with the altitude. Between two of those lifted roots, half hidden in the shadow they cast, was a seam in the rock, narrower than her hand, running a foot or so in either direction before disappearing under the frozen soil. She knelt and put her cheek near it. This was something Silas had shown her. In the first winter, when they were still learning the cabin's particular failures, how to test for a draft with the side of the face where the skin is thinnest, where the nerve endings are closest to the surface, where the body is most honest about what it feels. The air that breathed out of that seam stopped her heart for the space of 2 beats. It was not the dead mineral cold of frozen stone. It was dry. It carried a faint warmth, not fire warmth, not the warmth of any living thing she could name, but something older and steadier and more patient than either of those. The smell was of deep rock and ancient dark, of a place that had never in its long existence known the season that was bearing down on the canyon above it. Soot pressed his nose to the seam beside her and made a sound low in his throat, half longing, half satisfaction, the sound of a creature who has been trying to communicate something important for a very long time and has finally been understood. She knelt there in the cold with the rock's warm breath against her cheek and something cracked open in her that the weeks of grief and dispossession had been building toward without her knowing it. Through the crack came Silas's voice. Not as memory exactly, she had memory enough of him, and she knew its texture. This was closer to presence. As though the thin, high air had carried him back down the canyon to stand at her shoulder, the way he used to stand in the evenings when she was working at the stove, and he had come in and not announced himself, just stood nearby in the particular stillness of a man who is content to be somewhere. She remembered the first winter they had spent in this canyon. The cabin was not well chinked when they arrived, and no matter how she packed the gaps, the frost came through, and the floorboards drank the warmth out of the room until her feet ached from the cold of the boards themselves. She had complained about it across the supper table, one evening particularly, with the detailed precision of a woman who has been cold all day and wants the persons across from her to understand exactly what kind of cold she means. Silas had listened the way he listened to everything, turning it over in his mind without rushing it, and then he had smiled the tired smile that lived somewhere under the coal dust and the day's accumulated weight. He told her that down in the deep drifts, in the working levels far below the surface, it was never winter. She had argued, imagining the mine as a kind of frozen hell, stone walls pressing in, cold that had never known the sun. He shook his head. Not deep enough, he said. Go down past the frost line, 30 feet, 40 feet, and the earth simply forgets the snow, forgets the wind, forgets every season that has ever driven men to their knees up here on the surface. It holds the memory of summer all the year around, consistent as a heartbeat. He had laid his calloused palm flat on the table when he said it, as though he could feel that buried warmth pressing up through the floorboards. 52 degrees, he told her. Every day God sends, whether it's blazing July or the worst January this canyon has ever managed. We take our coats off to work the deep levels. We sweat down there while you're freezing up here, and that's the joke of it. The warmest place in the whole country is the one place nobody wants to go. She had half believed him and half humored him the way wives humor tired husbands who bring home strange facts from work, setting the information in the back of the mind without weighing it, the way you set something on a shelf because you don't know yet what to do with it. The second time the subject came up was deeper in that same first winter, when Silas came home with his forearm wrapped where a piece of falling timber had caught him a glancing blow. While she tended it and he gritted his teeth against the ache, he told her about a bear they had found that afternoon at the mouth of an abandoned prospect tunnel. Fat and winter-dreaming, sleeping through the killing months in a hole that some long-gone prospector had driven into the hillside looking for color that was never there. The bear knows, Silas said, working the stiffness out of his good hand by the fire. The bear knows what the earth remembers, and the bear is not too proud to use it. The old prospectors drove these tunnels before the company ever surveyed this ground, chasing veins that didn't pay out, and when they gave up they left the holes behind. The holes stayed warm, warmer and drier than any cabin a timberman's wages will buy, if they were driven right, if the grade runs water out instead of letting it pool. A bad tunnel drowns you slowly in the damp. A good one keeps you the way a jar keeps preserves sealed against the season outside, protected from everything the air above the frost line is trying to do to anything living. She had laughed at him then, the idea of living in a hole like a bear. He had laughed too, and the conversation had drifted to other things, and the knowledge had settled to the bottom of their married life like silt, forgotten, waiting. There was a third moment, the last one, the morning that turned out to be the final morning, though neither of them knew it while it was happening. Silas crouched in the doorway to lace his boots, and he pressed his bare hand flat against the floorboards for a moment in the way she had seen him do 100 times without thinking to ask about. A habit like the way some men touch a door frame going out or a horse's neck before mounting. He straightened up and said, half joking, the way he said things that were not quite jokes, "If this house ever gets cold enough to be a danger to you, remember to go deep enough." She told him to watch his footing in the lower drifts and come home at a decent hour. He went, the mountain kept him. Kneeling on the frozen slope with the earth's warm breath against her face, she understood at last what he had been giving her in those 3 scattered moments, not one lesson but the pieces of a single lesson, handed over across years of ordinary evenings at a pine table, spread so thin across time that neither of them had recognized it as instruction. He had been telling her how to live. He had not known he was doing it. The not knowing was what made it the truest thing he had ever given her, truer than the ring, truer than any word said in deliberate intention. A gift he had let fall without noticing, on his way out the door to die. Soot pressed his side against her leg. She could feel his warmth through the cloth of her skirt, steady and certain, and she rested one hand on his head and felt his solidity under her palm. She had $12 in silver. She had a dog who had bled his own paws for 3 weeks to show her something she had been too grief-blinded to see. She had the accumulated knowledge of 3 evenings' worth of a tired man's table talk, dropped like seed into the soil of a marriage, and choosing this exact frozen afternoon to break the surface. It was not yet knowledge. It was belief, and belief was the most fragile thing in the world to wager a life on. But it was a map. The only map she had. The map pointed at a worthless shoulder of company land that no one wanted, no one watched, no one had ever thought to lock. That was more than anything else in the whole canyon was offering her. She stood up from her crouch and looked down at the town below. The false front of the company store, presenting a square proud face to the road while concealing the single sloping room behind it. The saloon. The boarding house with its one inadequate chimney. The church where Dorothea Vane's husband promised eternal warmth to people who were freezing in the present. All of it clinging to the mountainside on the strength of a single unexamined article of faith, that a solid roof and a hot stove would carry any family through any winter these mountains could deliver. She had believed that once. She had believed that a company that took a man's labor would honor the life built around it, that neighbors who brought soup in the first raw weeks of widowhood would still know her name in the 8th, that the world, underneath its hardness, ran in some rough proportion to what people deserved. The believing had been easy. It had required nothing. It had changed nothing. What the believing had produced was a woman standing on a frozen slope with $12, while the men who had drawn a line through her name rode home to warm parlors and slept the untroubled sleep of the administratively just. She came down off the hill with her mind running 4 steps ahead of her body. She was thinking in a new register, not the register of grief, not the register of injustice, but the cold, precise register of engineering, of problems that had solutions if you were willing to discard everything you thought you knew about where solutions were permitted to come from. She would need a pick. She would need the garden shovel Silas had used to work their small vegetable plot in the brief growing season the canyon allowed. She would need canvas, heavy freight canvas, the kind that turned weather and rope, and stovepipe, and things she could not buy in Jasper Gulch because her credit there was as dead as her husband's account. She would need 4 days. She had 4 days before Gilbert Crane came back up this road with a new lock for the door of house number 11, a house she had already decided in the most private chamber of her heart to leave behind. The town would see her going up that slope with tools over her shoulder and would draw its conclusions without difficulty, because the conclusions were right there to be drawn by anyone who was not going to look past the obvious. A grief-maddened woman scratching at frozen ground like the creature her mourning had made of her. It would confirm everything Dorothea Vane had been saying in the warm parlors. It would settle the question of her fate to everyone's satisfactions except her own. Let them watch. Let them settle it. They were measuring her against the world. They thought they understood the world of company ledgers and lockable doors and weather that killed the unprepared. In that world they were entirely correct. In that world she was already a corpse, waiting only for the cold to finish the paperwork. But beneath that world there was an older one, a world that had been keeping its slow, patient promise in the dark for longer than any mining company had existed on the surface above it, a world that did not read ledgers, a world that could not be evicted, that held the memory of summer 40 feet down in the unmoving dark and released it degree by steady degree to anything wise enough and humble enough to come in out of the wind. Soot came down to her at last, his torn paws leaving small dark stars in the frost, his weight leaning into her leg. She rested her hand on his head. The town had looked at her and seen the ending of a story it recognized. It had told itself that story with such conviction that it had started to resemble truth. What Rowena Marsh had found on the slope above them pressed into her cheek like a word spoken directly into the place where the hearing was finest was the first line of a completely different story, one that no one in Jasper Gulch had read before, one that began not in the company's ledger but in the slow, deep pulse of the mountain itself, which had been keeping its promise through every hard winter this canyon had ever endured, whether or not a single person alive knew it was there. She walked back toward the cabin as the last of the afternoon light retreated up the south wall of the canyon. The cold was already sharpening toward dark, turning from discomfort into something with more authority. She could feel it searching for the gaps in her coat, the spaces at her wrists and collar where the warmth leaked out. Tomorrow she would take the pick off its hook in the lean-to. She would take the shovel. She would carry them up the slope in the gray light before anyone in town was awake enough to read her movements correctly, and she would begin the work that the earth had been holding in trust for her since before she was born, since before the company filed its first claim in a lowland courthouse, since before anyone drew a map of this canyon or decided who owned what portion of its rock. 4 days. 4 days to answer a red stamp with her own hands on ground that the company had never once thought worth a second glance. Soot pressed close against her leg as they walked, his breath pluming in the failing light, his certainty unchanged by the cold, or the dark, or the distance from the place he had been trying to show her for 3 weeks. His work was done. He had pointed as clearly as he knew how. The rest of it was hers. She was on the slope before first light, the pick balanced on her shoulder, the shovel dragging its blade through the frost-killed grass behind her. Soot moved ahead of her in the dark, sure-footed on ground he had memorized through 3 weeks of daily pilgrimage, his body a darker shape against the darkness. The stars were still out, the kind of hard winter stars that appear when the air is too dry to soften their edges, each one a chip of cold light with nothing gentle in it. By the time she reached the seam in the rock, the eastern ridge had begun to pale, not quite dawn, but the first suggestion that dawn was the direction things were moving. She stood over the spot for a moment, with the pick in both hands, feeling the weight of it settle into her grip. Then she set the point against the frozen ground and swung. The first hour was a negotiation she was losing. The surface gave nothing iron ground, locked solid to a depth she could not yet guess, every blow of the pick ringing back through the handle into her palms with a flat refusal that had nothing personal in it. The frost did not care about her situation. The cold did not make exceptions. She found her rhythm anyway, the way she had found it at the chopping block, letting the weight of the tool do what her arms could not sustain alone, making herself a hinge, the pick a falling thing that she guided rather than drove. Chip by chip the surface yielded, reluctant as ice on a February river, cracking in pieces that skittered down the slope and vanished into the gray. Soot dug beside her at the seam, his paws working the same surface with the same useless devotion he had maintained for weeks. He accomplished nothing measurable. His certainty never shifted by a degree. She found, watching him from the corner of her eye, that his certainty fed hers across the cold ground between them, not through any logic she could name, but the way warmth travels between two bodies pressed together in the dark. His belief in the place was older than her belief, and more absolute, having never been complicated by doubt. Somewhere past the first hour the pick broke through. Not a dramatic collapse, a yielding, a change in resistance so sudden she nearly overbalanced on the follow-through. The point had punched into something that gave instead of fighting back, gravel, loose soil, the layer beneath the surface where the frost had not yet extended its claim. She knelt immediately, drove her bare hand into the opening she had made, felt the cold of the earth below ordinary cold, the cold of dirt in October, with none of the killing mineral hardness of the frozen crust above. She had passed the first gate. The realization moved through her, not as relief but as recalibration, the way a navigator feels when a landmark confirms the chart is accurate. There was still everything to do. There was now reason to do it. She traded the pick for the shovel. The character of the work changed completely, not the sharp, percussive fight of breaking surface, but the steady, rhythmic labor of moving material, load by load, the blade biting and lifting in a cycle she could sustain for hours if her back held out. The hole deepened. The pile of displaced earth and gravel grew beside her on the slope. Soot abandoned his own excavation and sat watching her work with the focused attention of a foreman reviewing progress. By midday of the second day, she was 4 feet down, the walls of her excavation rising to her shoulders when she stood in it. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the fresh-cut earth around her was already beginning to crust at the edges, the frost reaching for the wound she had opened. She worked faster. Time was the element she could not manufacture more of. The blade found it on the afternoon of the third day, a sound so different from rock or soil that she stopped mid-stroke and stood absolutely still, listening to the echo of it, hollow, resonant, the specific voice of seasoned wood under impact which carries a tone no stone can imitate. She cleared the soil by hand, fingers working into the gaps around the obstruction, pulling dirt away from the surface below in palmfuls until the gray grain of old timber showed through a beam set horizontal, weathered to the color of ash, but solid under her knuckles when she rapped it. The wood rang with the clean note of good material, dried long past the point where rot could find purchase. She worked along its length until she found the vertical posts framing it, 2 of them, standing where men long dead had set them by candlelight at the end of their ambition. Between the posts the space was filled with fitted rock and packed earth, a deliberate seal, careful as the work of people who understood that an open hole in a hillside was a hazard to anything walking on 4 legs or 2. They had closed it conscientiously, those long-gone men, at the bitter end of a failed season when their grubstake was spent and their hope was gone. But they had closed it in haste, with winter coming at their backs, and haste leaves seams. It leaves the specific seam that a brindle dog had been breathing at in the dark for 3 weeks. The 4th day, the day before Crane's deadline, she worked without stopping except to drink water and eat the 2 biscuits she had brought, wrapped in cloth. Her palms had blistered through, the blisters broken, the raw skin beneath beginning to toughen in the way skin toughens when it has no choice. Each stone she pulled from the fill came away with a red smear where she had gripped it. She registered the pain the way she registered the cold, as information, as the body's report on what it was being asked to do, useful data rather than a reason to stop. By the hour the light died behind the western wall of the canyon, she had opened a gap wide enough to take a body. She lowered the lantern into the darkness first, watching the flame for any sign of bad air, a flicker toward extinction, a color shift in the light. The flame burned clean. She drew a long breath of what came up from below, testing it against the back of her throat, dry, cool mineral, carrying the specific smell of stone that has never been disturbed by weather, the smell of permanence, the smell of deep. She went in head first, sliding down through the gap, catching herself on the old timber frame, dropping the last 2 feet to the tunnel floor. The lantern swung in her hand, casting its pool of yellow light across what 3 decades of darkness had kept intact. The tunnel ran true, 5 feet high, 4 wide, timbered at intervals with sets that the original men had driven well. The marks of their hand tools covered the walls in the overlapping pattern of patient work done by candlelight, each stroke placed with care by someone who understood that the mountain above him was not his enemy, but his partner in an uncertain negotiation. The floor was soft earth, undisturbed. She moved forward slowly, holding the flame high, reading the timber sets with the eye Silas had educated without intending to, watching for the bow that meant overload, the dark weeping streak that announced water behind the wall, the gray crumble that signaled rot, working from the inside out. She found none of these things. The tunnel was dry. The sets were sound. The grade ran slightly uphill as she moved inward, which meant any water that found its way in would run back out, rather than collecting at the working end. After 50 feet, the tunnel opened. She stopped because the space that met her was not what she had been expecting. Not another length of timbered passage, but a chamber 10 feet wide, 12 feet long, the ceiling brushing her outstretched fingers. The walls bore the same hand tool markings as the passage behind her, but the shape of the space itself followed a natural contour that the rock had offered, and the men had enlarged rather than created. They had found a hollow in the body of the mountain, a pocket where the stone had parted in some ancient settling, and they had widened it with their picks into a room a person could stand in, could turn around in, could live in, if living in such a place were a thing one would choose. She held her bare hand out into the still air of the chamber. The air met her palm without the aggressive cold that the surface world pressed against every exposed surface. It was cool, the specific cool of a place shielded from both the sun's heat and the sky's cold, the temperature of the deep middle of things. From somewhere further in the mountain, from some depth below the reach of her lantern, a faint current of warmer air drifted upward, barely perceptible, real. The 52 degrees her husband had carried home to her in his tired hands across a supper table, as though it were simply a fact about the world he thought she might want to know. She set the lantern on the floor, stood in the gold of it with her back straight. Her heart was doing something irregular, not from the climb or the labor, but from the sheer weight of what she had found. The distance between where she had been standing a week ago with a red-stamped notice in her hand and where she was standing now. Her voice came out rough from disuse, the words going into the dark where no living ear was waiting. You were right about the deep, Silas. The earth holds what the world above it forgets. The flame gave her nothing back but its steady hiss, which was exactly the right answer. The answer of something that simply is, that does not argue or comfort or ask anything in return. She did not sleep in the chamber that first night. A shelter was not a shelter until it could actually shelter, until the cold that current flowed freely through the open entrance had been addressed, until the smoke of any fire she lit had a way out that would not also serve as a way for the heat to leave. What she had found was a beginning. A beginning required tools she did not yet possess. She climbed back out through the gap into a night that had deepened toward a cold that pressed against her face like a flat, deliberate hand, and she went back down the slope to the cabin that was no longer hers to sleep, one last time in the bed she had shared with Silas. She left before dawn for Delwood, taking the road that curved away from Jasper Gulch's main street rather than through it. 7 miles on foot in October dark, Soot ranging ahead and behind as was his custom when they traveled, his paws healed enough now to carry him without leaving marks in the frost. The walking gave her time to count what she had and set each dollar against its work. The mercantile in Delwood kept no ledger with her name in it, no page that could be closed against her. Walking through its door was the first moment in 2 months that she had stood in a room where her presence was commercially neutral, where she was simply a person with money, which was the only qualification the transaction required. Bertie Oakes ran the place. She was a widow herself, a broad-handed woman past 60 who had put her husband in the ground 9 years ago and built the business larger since than it had been when she inherited it. She watched Rowena's hands as the order was laid out on the counter. 20 yards of heavy canvas, the kind stretched over freight loads to turn serious weather. Brass grommets and the awl to set them. 2 coils of rope rated for load-bearing work. Cast iron stovepipe in sections with a damper collar and a rain cap for the upper end. Bertie filled the order without commentary. When the goods were stacked, she studied the hands that had laid the coins on her counter, the split skin, the bruised nails, the particular damage of someone who had been doing the work of 3 people without adequate equipment. She added a second coil of rope to the pile and pushed it across the worn counter surface. For the dog, she said. Her voice was dry as kindling in August, not looking at Rowena when she said it, looking at the invoice she was writing, as though the matter were clerical. Both women understood it was not for the dog. Both women let the small fiction stand, because certain kindnesses can only be given if they travel disguised as something else. An act of charity accepted straight on by a proud woman costs the giver something. Dressed as a commercial transaction for the benefit of a dog, it costs nothing. Both of them were practical enough to prefer the version that worked. The remaining $2 went to supplies calibrated for survival rather than comfort: dried beans in a cloth sack, flour, salt, lamp oil. She declined the offer of delivery. A delivery meant a driver. The driver meant an account of where the goods were going. The account meant the news would travel back to Jasper Gulch ahead of her. Her single greatest advantage in the entire situation was that nobody was paying attention to the precise details of where the widow had gone and what she had taken with her. She had no intention of spending that advantage on the small convenience of not having to pull a handcart. Bertie lent her the cart on the strength of a look that passed between them without requiring translation. No deposit asked for. The return of the cart was left to good faith. 7 miles back up the canyon road with the cart's iron wheels grinding in the frozen ruts, The rope harness Rowena had improvised sitting across her shoulders and chest, the cold deepening as the afternoon shortened. The weight was significant. The terrain was uneven. Soot trotted alongside in a fashion that suggested he would help if he could, which he could not. She leaned into the harness each time the grade steepened, using her body the way she used the axe, not forcing, not fighting, but committing weight intelligently to the problem. The dark came down before she reached the slope below the hummock, and she covered the last mile by feel and by Soot's sure knowledge of the terrain, trusting the dog the way she had been learning slowly to trust everything she could not fully explain. The work that filled the days that followed was measured not against comfort but against a deadline the weather was setting independently of any company agent. She could feel the season tightening the way. She could feel the change in a headache when it shifts from warning to arrival. A pressure in the whole sky, a quality to the silence between gusts that was not silence at all, but held breath. She cut the canvas with Silas's hunting knife, a blade kept sharp out of habit by a man who believed that a dull tool was a form of disrespect to the work. The canvas was stiff in the cold, resisting the knife until she learned to score rather than saw, to let the blade find the grain of the weave rather than fight it. She worked the brass grommets in by hand with the awl, punching and setting in the rhythm of sustained, unspectacular effort, the kind of effort that does not feel like progress until you look back and measure the distance covered. She built 2 doors, not one, hung them in the throat of the tunnel 6 feet apart, so that anyone passing in or out moved first through a dead space of trapped, motionless air before reaching the weather beyond. The principle came not from any textbook, but from the memory of better houses. She had lived in houses where the cold always seemed to die in the small vestibule between the outer door and the inner one, as though it ran out of force in that interval. She had reasoned it into a system and trusted the reasoning the way she had learned to trust her dog, completely without sentiment. The stovepipe was the hardest problem. She needed the smoke from any fire to exit the chamber without serving simultaneously as a channel through which the precious warmth could drain. A pipe run straight up through 40 feet of rock was not something she could accomplish in the time she had, or with the tools she carried. She searched the chamber and the passage with the lantern held low and high, looking for what the rock had already offered rather than what she would need to create from nothing. 2 hours into the search she found it, a natural fissure near the chamber's entrance, running upward at an angle through the stone, wide enough to take the pipe sections one at a time if she fed them in carefully and held her breath in the cramped dark. The fissure exited the slope approximately 5 feet above the tunnel mouth by a screen of juniper that would scatter and obscure whatever emerged from it. She sealed the joints between the pipe and the rock with mortar. She mixed from gray clay, scraped off the tunnel floor, and water from melted snow, working it into every gap with her thumbs until the joints held. The test fire, a small handful of juniper branches, green enough to produce visible smoke, drew clean. The smoke traveled the full length of the pipe and exited at the top in a thin, pale thread that dispersed in the cold air within a few feet, invisible against the gray-white sky from any distance greater than the immediate slope. Moving the stove took most of one day. The cast-iron body weighed more than she did, and the path from the cabin to the tunnel entrance included a pitch steep enough that the stove shifted on the cart twice, and nearly took her with it when she threw herself against the load to arrest the slide. Her shoulders ached at a depth she had not experienced before, not the surface soreness of unfamiliar exercise, but something structural, something that lived in the joints rather than the muscle, and sent its report up through her neck and into the base of her skull. She ignored it with the practiced discipline of a woman who had learned that her body's complaints, while legitimate, were not in a position to be accommodated at present. When the stove sat at last on the bed of fitted flat stones she had laid for it, when the pipe collar seeded into the fissure connection, and she lit the first real fire and watched the smoke draw straight and clean into the rock, without hesitation she sat down on the chamber floor with her back against the earth wall, her hands hanging loose between her knees, and did not move for a very long time. Something in her chest that had been clenched since the morning the red-stamped notice arrived began, by degrees too small to name individually, to release. She slept one final night in the cabin. Not from any practical necessity, the chamber was already warmer than the cabin with its cold stove, but from a stubbornness of attachment she chose not to examine. The table that Silas's hands had left their grain in, the shelf he had measured twice before cutting, the window through which she had watched the seasons change for 7 years. She lay in the dark with these things around her and let herself feel their weight fully, one last time before she carried what could be carried, and left the rest to the inventory Crane would take when he arrived. In the morning she made 3 trips up the slope. The quilt her mother had stitched, the good iron pots, the Shakespeare, worn to softness at the spine, with passages marked in Silas's hand, not notes exactly, just small marks beside lines he had wanted to find again, evidence of a man reading slowly and taking things seriously, the split pine that was hers by labor, if not by the company's legal reasoning. The last thing she did before leaving house number 11 was to open the front door and walk away from it without closing it behind her. The stove cold, the table bare, an empty room waiting for the man whose company number would replace Silas's, whose name the eviction notice had not needed to provide. She had removed everything that had made the space particular to herself. What Crane would find when he arrived with his new lock was a house that had already been vacated, not by compulsion, but by decision, which was a distinction that mattered to her even if it would mean nothing to the man with the folio. She was clearing the far end of the chamber 3 days later, scraping back the floor to extend the sleeping area, when the shovel blade turned against something that was not rock. The sound it made, a dull, contained resonance, nothing like the ring of struck stone, made her stop immediately. She worked around the obstruction by hand, following its edges until she understood what she was touching, a tin canister, set deliberately into a shallow niche cut into the back wall of the chamber at shin height. Not dropped or lost. Placed. The niche itself had been cut with some care, as though the person making it understood that what they were storing deserved to sit level. The canister was rusted at the seams and corners, but intact. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth cracked with age but still serviceable, a folded sheaf of papers. The ink had faded from black to the brown of old dried blood, but the figures were legible in the lantern light, the dates unmistakable. A prospector's location notice, a recorded claim, a witness statement with 2 signatures below it, filed in the spring of 1879, 9 years before Stanton and Vail Consolidated had surveyed this canyon or paid $1 for a foot of its rock. She read the documents twice, understanding accumulating slowly the way it does when the significance of something exceeds what you were prepared to receive. Then she folded them along their original creases, returned them to the oilcloth, settled the tin back into its niche. Some things needed to be held rather than used, kept in reserve against the hour when they would be worth more than everything else combined. This was one of those things. She left it where it had waited for 9 years and went back to her work. The first serious cold front arrived on the 3rd of November, 2 days after the lock on house number 11 had been changed on a door that opened onto a room with nothing in it. The front dropped 30 degrees out of the air in the span of half an hour, not weather but a verdict, delivered with the blunt authority of altitude. The cabins in Jasper Gulch contracted audibly in the cold, their joints cracking as the wood gave up what warmth it had stored. The wind found the canyon and settled into it as though it intended to stay. Rowena sat behind her 2 canvas doors with soot against her legs, the lantern burning at the lower end of its wick to conserve oil, and listened to the storm spend itself against the world outside. What reached her through the rock and the earth and the 50 feet of tunnel between herself and the entrance was a sound she would come to know as her measure of safety, the muffled, distant voice of weather that could not find her. Not silence. Something better than silence, the sound of something formidable, trying very hard to reach something it could not locate. She lit the stove with 3 pieces of pine, not for heat, not yet, but to establish the baseline, to give the experiment the conditions it required. Before the fire, the thermometer she had salvaged from the cabin wall read 52 degrees, the number Silas had carried home to her like a fact he thought she might want, not knowing she would one day need it more than she had ever needed anything. After an hour of small fire, the glass read 64. She dressed for the weather anyway, coat, boots, the scarf she had knitted herself 2 winters ago, and went through both canvas doors to the outside. The world she stepped into had been reorganized by cold and wind into something geometrically pure and hostile. Everything soft had been scoured away, everything exposed had been covered, and the temperature pressed against her face with the specific authority of something that has decided you are in its way. She extended the thermometer at arm's length and counted to 60 the way Silas had shown her to count seconds in the dark of the mind, deliberately, evenly, giving the mercury time to tell the truth. 5 degrees below zero. She brought the thermometer back inside and held it in the lantern light. The mercury had fallen to its true number for the world above her. Inside, behind the 2 canvas doors, the same instrument read 64 degrees. The difference between those 2 columns of mercury was 69 degrees, created from nothing but the Earth's patient memory of warmth and the labor of her own hands. She pressed one palm flat against the earthen wall of the chamber, cool and alive, the specific temperature of a thing that breathes slowly, that measures time in a unit larger than years. She had wagered everything she had left on a promise this mountain had been making for longer than any deed or survey had existed in the territory, and the mountain was keeping it. Her voice went into the dark of the chamber. At a level just above a whisper, the earth remembers summer. Tonight it remembers for me. The doubt was gone out of her. Not the difficulty was everywhere. Structural. Built into the basic conditions of her situation. Present in every component of the months ahead. But difficulty without doubt is simply work, and work had never frightened her. December came down on Jasper Gulch with the efficiency of a system that has been running for a very long time. Rowena settled into the discipline that the chamber's physics required. She burned wood only in the evenings, understanding the stove always as the supplement and never the foundation, the comfortable margin laid lightly over the earth's bedrock contribution. She melted snow for water in a pot that sat on the cooling iron after the evening fire died down. Her meals were bean stew and pan-fried flatbread, the same rotation repeated without variation, and she found to her own mild surprise that the sameness was not deprivation. Sameness in a warm, dry room was a thing the families below her, with all their variety of stores, were having increasing trouble reliably providing. She spoke mostly to Soot, the Shakespeare slowly, hearing the words in Silas's deliberate voice, the voice of a man who took things seriously and did not rush through them. She mended what tore, slept when the lamp oil ran low, woke before the light, banked the fire, fed the dog, lived. She lived where the consensus of the entire canyon had agreed she would not, and the living was quiet, and it was hers, and it was sufficient. Then, in the middle of December, Soot got into something on the slope. He had taken to making short excursions beyond the canvas doors during the day, necessary ones, practical, lasting no more than a few minutes at a time. On one of these he found something frozen in the snow cover on the upper slope, something buried and thawed just enough on a slightly warmer afternoon to smell like what it was. She did not know exactly what he had eaten. She knew what happened afterward. By the following morning he was a different animal entirely. He lay in the corner where he had been sleeping rather than rising when she moved, which was the first warning sign. His nose had gone dry and hot, the surface of it carrying a faint warmth against her palm that had no business being there. When she set food before him, he turned his head away with a slowness that was not fastidiousness but exhaustion. His breathing had a rhythm that was too fast and too shallow for a dog at rest. She sat with her hand on his side, counting the respirations, and felt the cold arithmetic of her situation move through her like water through a crack. Keeping Soot warm enough to fight the fever through its crisis required sustained heat more than the Earth's steady 52 could supply on its own, enough to hold the chamber near 60 or above through the nights when fever runs its hardest and the body's resources are most strained. Sustained heat meant sustained burning. Sustained burning meant consuming in a week or two what she had rationed to last the rest of the winter, the careful reserve that stood between her and the bare minimum that the ground provided. Bend the wood on the dog, survive the fever, lose the cushion, face whatever came next without any margin. Keep the wood, preserve the margin, lose the dog. She sat with the calculation for a long time, her hand resting on Soot's ribcage, feeling it rise and fall with the compromised rhythm of a body fighting something it had not chosen. She thought about the 3 weeks on the frozen slope, the split pause, the absolute certainty of an animal pointing at the one thing in an indifferent landscape that might be made to serve her. The weight of him against her leg on the morning they brought Silas off the mountain on a board, when the whole human world was moving away from her, and this one creature moved closer. There was, she found when she looked at it honestly, no real calculation to perform. The math had the shape of a choice but not the substance of one. She fed the fire. Through the first night she burned what she had been hoarding. Through the second night, when the fever climbed to its highest reach, she burned more. Soot's breathing came in cycles, labored, then briefly easier, then labored again, and she sat beside him. Between each piece of wood she added, her hand on his side, tracking the cycle with the patient attention of someone who has nothing else to do and nowhere else to be. She did not sleep. When sleep moved close, she pushed it off, the way you push off something that cannot be allowed to arrive yet. In the gray, lightless hour before the fourth day's dawn, Soot's breathing changed. The cycle lengthened. The intervals of easier breath grew longer. The tight, rapid shallowness of fever loosened into something that was not quite normal but was moving in that direction, the way a knotted rope moves when someone is working it loose. She felt the change under her hand before she heard it in the rhythm, a slackening, a release, the body reclaiming its own governance after the fever had held it. He opened his eyes in the early light and looked at her with the unclouded eyes of a dog who has returned from wherever fever carries things and found the same person waiting at the landing. The stove was cold, not banked, not low cold, the last coal gone to ash sometime in the fourth hour of the night, every piece of reserve wood reduced to what the ash pan held. She looked at the thermometer. The mercury stood at 52 degrees, unchanged, unconcerned with the death of the fire, with the 4 nights of burning that had preceded the cold stove, with any of the human drama that had played out in this chamber while the mountain simply maintained its position. The fire was the guest. The earth was the host. The guest had burned what it had to burn and gone out, and the host had continued, without acknowledgement, without adjustment, without requiring anything from the people who had been warming themselves at its table. She bent her face down to the warm fur of Soot's neck and held it there, feeling the living heat of him against her forehead. The chamber held its steady temperature around them both, asking nothing, offering everything it had always offered. She had given away the last margin she had for the sake of a living thing she loved. The earth had covered the debt without being asked. The town found her in January. Dorothea Vane organized the search party with the efficiency of a woman who needs to be doing something because the alternative is sitting with what she has said. 7 men with the minister at their front climbed the snow-locked slope on a morning so bright after the previous week's overcast that the world seemed to be lit from beneath the snow rather than above it. Dorothea had called it a welfare check in the parlors where she organized it, which was accurate in the way that a map is accurate. It showed the shape of things without conveying what it felt like to move through them. What moved her was not charity. It was the growing discomfort of being the loudest voice predicting an outcome that had not occurred on any of the timelines her confidence had established. They followed the faint evidence of foot traffic on the slope barely visible under the recent snowfall. More suggestion than path to a section of hillside that none of them had ever had occasion to examine. 2 canvas panels hung in the face of what appeared, from the outside, to be simply a disturbance in the slope, a crack in the mountain, dressed up with rope and cloth. Dorothea called Rowena's name into the rock, her voice carrying the tight quality of a woman managing something she had not prepared language for. Rowena came out through the outer canvas into the hard January light, blinking against the brightness, her hand raised against the glare. She stood in the entrance of her shelter and regarded the group of people who had climbed a steep, snow-covered slope in bitter cold to confirm what they had already decided. She was none of the things they had come expecting to find. Not frostbitten at the extremities, not hollow-eyed with hunger, not shaking or crouched in on herself or any of the recognizable postures of defeat. Her face held the specific color of someone who has been sleeping adequately in a warm room and eating enough to support the work her days required. Her eyes were clear. Dorothea Vane's entire prepared speech, which she had refined across several versions in the warm privacy of her own home, died in her throat at the sight of Rowena's face. "We feared you had perished," she managed finally. Her gaze moved past Rowena to the thin thread of smoke rising from the fissure in the rock above the entrance, to the evidence neat, inexplicable, organized of habitation in a place where habitation should have been impossible. "I am managing fine, Mrs. Vane." Nothing offered beyond that. No invitation through the canvas. No explanation of the temperature differential between the inside of the slope and the outside of it. No triumph, no recrimination, no accounting. Just the fact, offered plainly, because it was the only fact that was actually anyone else's business. The 7 men stood in the cold and looked at the smoke thread and the canvas doors and the calm, well-fed woman, and found that none of what they were seeing assembled into a category they owned. It was not a cabin, not a tent, not a dugout or a cave or anything a man could put a word to with confidence. A thing without a word is a thing a frightened community cannot easily process, and a thing a frightened community cannot easily process tends to grow in the telling till it is larger than what was actually found on the slope. They went back down to Jasper Gulch, carrying not the relief they had climbed up, expecting but a confusion that would outlast the winter in ways none of them anticipated. Gilbert Crane came a week later. Not from concern. Concern was a sentiment his leather folio had no column to record. He came because the rumors had climbed to his heated office with the insistence of something that demanded a formal response, and because a thing happening on company land without his authorization was, in his view, a thing happening without permission, which in his view was the same as happening incorrectly. He rode up with 2 company men behind him on horses hired for the purpose and found Rowena outside, splitting a fallen branch with a hatchet, working with the economical steadiness of someone who has found a pace she can maintain indefinitely and sees no reason to alter it for an audience. Marsh. He dropped even the minimal courtesy of her married name. "This is company land. You are trespassing upon it." She did not stop the hatchet's work. "I am not in your house, Mr. Crane. You changed the lock on that door yourself. You were instructed to leave the valley entirely." The hatchet paused. She looked up at him with an expression that had nothing he could use in it, no fear to feed on, no defiance that his authority could push against, only a flat and complete stillness. "I am not in your valley. I am in the hill." He strode to the canvas and pulled the outer panel aside with the head of his riding crop, thrusting his face into the air of the lock space. The warmth hit him mineral, faintly smoky, carrying the particular quality of air that has not been in contact with the open sky in a very long time. He could not see past the inner canvas into the chamber beyond. He could not, in the gloom of the passageway, comprehend any system or structure. He saw a hole in the ground. He saw what his categories had prepared him to see. He turned back to her. His judgment had been formed before the evidence reached him, which was his customary practice. "You choose to live like an animal in the dirt." The contempt in his voice was real, and it came from a specific place, the outrage of a man whose entire professional authority rested on the sacred administrative distinction between a house, which was a thing that could manage and permit and revoke, and a hole, which was a thing below the level of management altogether. "So be it. Let the winter have you." The 2 company men behind him said nothing. They looked at the snow on the surrounding slope, at each other, at the thin smoke rising from the fissure above the entrance. They did not look like men who were comfortable with the instruction their employer had just issued. The 3 of them rode back down the canyon road. Rowena stood in the ringing silence they left behind, the hatchet loose in her hand, her face unchanged. She had been told by a man who held every practical advantage in the situation to wait for the weather to finish what he was unwilling to finish himself. She had heard this before, from the same source, and it had motivated her to build the room she was now standing outside of. What Crane did when he returned to his office was the thing no one in Jasper Gulch would have predicted, because it ran directly against the grain of the contempt he had performed on the slope, because it required him to admit, in the most private chambers of his administrative conscience, that the woman in the hill had unsettled him in a way that his available tools for dismissal had not resolved. He drafted a formal removal demand and carried it to the district company attorney, expecting the machinery to turn, as it had always turned for the company, in the direction the company pointed it. The attorney was a careful man. He asked the question that Crane had never thought to ask in the months of managing this situation: whether the company's title to that specific shoulder of ground was clean and unencumbered. The old survey records, when retrieved and spread across a table, showed a prior claim, a prospector's location notice filed 9 years before Stanton and Vale had surveyed the canyon. The claim had never been formally extinguished. Its status was clouded. The attorney put the removal demand aside. He would not carry an eviction before a court on land whose title was under question, not for the small matter of removing one woman from one worthless hillside. The machine that Gilbert Crane had served faithfully for the entirety of his professional life had declined, for the first time he could recall, to serve him in return. He carried that refusal back up the canyon like a stone he had swallowed, sitting cold and heavy in his chest. He did not know, could not have imagined, that the woman in the hill held folded in oilcloth, in a rusted tin canister, the precise document that had reached through 9 years of darkness to stop his hand. The sky changed its character in the second week of January without bothering to announce the change. One morning it was the broken, variable gray of an ordinary mountain winter, a gray that had texture to it, that moved, that let through occasional pale light. The next morning it had become something else entirely, a flat, uniform pewter pressing down on the canyon from ridge to ridge like a lid set over a pot, motionless, featureless, carrying in its stillness the specific menace of a system that has finished gathering itself and is ready to spend what it has accumulated. The old men at Huggins's store fell silent when they looked at it. Not the productive silence of men thinking through a problem, but the silence of men who have run out of things to say that would be useful. The almanac had been right about everything so far: the early cold, the depth of the November freeze, the particular quality of the December storms. Looking at that sky, none of them were inclined to bet against it now. Rowena felt the change in her body before she stepped outside to confirm it with her eyes. A pressure at the base of the skull, a sense of the air having swallowed something large that it had not yet digested. She had been feeling weather in her bones since childhood. Her mother had called it a useless gift, since knowing a storm was coming did not make it go anywhere else, and what she felt on that January morning was not the ordinary premonitory ache of incoming snow, but something with more authority than that, something that had made up its mind. She checked her stores that afternoon with the methodical attention of an engineer reviewing load calculations before signing off on a structure. Beans, sufficient. Flour, sufficient. Lamp oil lower than she would have preferred, but manageable. Wood, gone. She had burned it all on Soot's fever in December and had not been able to replenish the supply through the cold weeks, since the accessible deadfall on the nearby slope buried under snow cover too deep to work through efficiently alone. The stove sat cold except on evenings when she permitted herself the small luxury of an hour's fire from the wood scraps she had accumulated, one piece at a time, broken branch ends, split sections salvaged from the lumber of the old collapsed fence line on the mine road's upper edge, nothing that constituted a reserve. She had the Earth's 52 degrees. She had no cushion above it. What she did not allow herself to spend time on was the version of the situation in which this was a catastrophe. The chamber would hold a survivable temperature regardless of what the sky was planning. She had proven that in December, in the most concrete terms available, mercury, in a glass tube, numbers that did not negotiate. The discomfort of 52 degrees in a serious cold snap was real. The lethality of it was not. The blizzard arrived on the 15th of January without the courtesy of a gradual opening. The wind came first, out of the northwest, moving through the canyon with a sound she had never heard before, not the familiar howl of a mountain gust, but a sustained, continuous roar at a pitch that sat just below the frequency of pain, as though the canyon itself were resonating with it. Within 2 hours the snow began, driven horizontal by a wind that had apparently decided that vertical was an insufficient application of its resources. The temperature at the Ironbark's weather station, according to the reading the mine superintendent posted on a board outside his office each morning, fell to 20 below zero before the end of the first day. By the end of the second day the number was 30 below, written in the superintendent's careful hand with no editorial comment because none was needed. The third night, the men in the company boarding house spoke in low voices about a cold approaching 50 below zero. There was no instrument in Jasper Gulch willing to confirm this number. There did not need to be. The cold itself was confirmation enough. A cold that moved through walls, that found gaps no builder had left deliberately, that reached through the gap between a man's cuff and his collar, and laid its hand against the skin there with a patience that did not feel impersonal. Jasper Gulch began to come apart in the way that structures always come apart, under loads they were not designed to carry, not all at once, dramatically, but in a series of private failures, each family alone in its own cold rooms discovering the specific place where its preparation ran out. The Caldwell boy was sent to the woodshed on the second morning, 40 yards from his own back door. The distance was nothing on any other day of the year, a child's errand, 2 minutes at most. In the blizzard it became something else entirely. The world beyond the door had reduced itself to a roaring white that contained no landmarks, no gradients, no information about direction. The boy stepped out, took 3 steps, and the door behind him vanished into the same white that surrounded him on every other side. His father heard the change in the wind's voice at the doorframe, heard or felt the difference between wind moving past a house and wind moving past a space that had just been opened into the house, and went out immediately, calling. He found his son 20 yards from the back step, standing absolutely still in the white, his arms at his sides, crying without sound, because the cold had already stolen the energy that crying required. The child's fingers had gone the gray-white of candle tallow, 2 of them badly enough that the feeling would not come back to them for weeks. But his father had him in his arms and through the door and pressed against the stove within the minute, and the boy recovered, and the family spent the rest of the 3 days pressed together in the single warm room with the stove burning everything they had laid in, rationing by the hour. The livery stable's roof had been carrying the weight of wet snow since the first day. On the night the central rafter cracked, not a slow failure, but a sudden one, a sound like a rifle shot that the wind absorbed before it had traveled 50 feet. The horses had been moved to the lower stalls by a stable hand who had listened to the roof long enough to distrust it, and they survived, pressing against one another in the dark and the cold, while the structure above them gave way in stages through the rest of the night. At the company boarding house, the single large stove worked past its design capacity against walls built of green lumber that had shrunk as it dried and left gaps at every joint. The miners slept in their coats, packed tight in their bunks, in the pragmatic arrangement of men who have set aside dignity in favor of shared warmth, their combined body heat doing for the room what the stove increasingly could not. Huggins opened the store on the morning of the 3rd day out of habit or duty or both, found the shelves nearest the outer walls had frozen solid overnight. The tin goods had expanded and split their seams, the contents crystallized inside their ruptured casings. He stood among the wreckage of a winter's inventory and understood something that the ledger in his hands had no column to express. The company's organizational systems, the credit accounts, the careful records of who owed, what to whom, none of it was keeping anyone warm. The ledger kept itself. It did not keep its keepers. Elmer Tack had prospected this range of mountains since before the Ironback was more than a surveyor's notation on a map. He had wintered in conditions that had broken younger men, had survived on resources that other men's accounting would have classified as insufficient. He was found on the 4th morning, sitting upright in the chair beside his cold stove, frost standing delicate on his eyelashes and in his white beard, the wood he had been burning through the long days of the storm exhausted sometime in the 2nd night. He had not gone out for more. His body had made the calculation that the cold outside the door was a worse option than the cold inside the room, and the calculation had been correct in every term except the final one. He died in his chair in his own home, surrounded by the evidence of a life lived in that canyon, and the town would not be able to bury him until the ground softened in March. Rowena knew none of this while it was happening. She was 50 feet inside a mountain that did not know the storm existed. The blizzard reached her as a distant bass rumble, a vibration in the rock more than a sound in the air, felt through the soles of her boots when she stood still, felt through the earthen wall when she pressed her palm to it. The snow accumulated above her on the slope, in whatever depth the wind was building it to, and the accumulation was a physical fact with no consequence for her whatsoever. The weight of the mountain was immeasurably greater than the weight of the snow. She was not asking the surface world to protect her. She had stepped entirely beneath it. The thermometer read 52 degrees without a fire, 63 when she allowed herself an hour of warmth from the wood scraps she had been collecting. She was not comfortable by the standards of a person with access to a well-stocked stove, but comfort had ceased to be the measure she was working against sometime in October. The measure was survival, and survival was a matter of record. She sat on her stool on the second night, with a cup of tea made from melted snow. Warming both hands, the lantern turned low, Soot's weight against her feet. She thought, without heat in the thinking, about Gilbert Crane and the words he had left on the slope, like something he did not expect to be held accountable for. Let the winter have you. The winter was outside, spending what it had accumulated over months of cold storage, working through every inadequacy of construction in every building in the canyon below her. It had found the gaps in everything that men had built on the surface of this ground. It had not found her. She had moved to a deeper address than the winter knew to look for. This house does not put its own out into the cold, she said, to no one except the dog at her feet and the rock around her, and perhaps the memory of the man whose words had led her to this room. The sentence came out steady, without drama, the tone of a fact being confirmed rather than an argument being won. On the fourth morning, the storm stopped. Not tapered, stopped, as though a mechanism had completed its cycle. The silence that followed was so absolute, so sudden, that it rang in the ears the way a struck bell rings after the clapper has stilled. The world outside, when Rowena broke through the 2 feet of snow that had sealed her entrance and emerged into it, had been remade into a geography of smooth white curves and hard blue shadow, every edge softened, every familiar reference point buried or altered. The air sat at 22 below zero and would not be moved by argument. The sun lit everything brilliantly and warmed nothing. She was standing in this reordered landscape, taking stock of what the storm had done to the slope around her entrance, the juniper half buried, the surface of the snow above her chamber as undisturbed as any other part of the slope, betraying nothing of what lay underneath when she heard the sound, a human voice at some distance, at a pitch that had nothing measured in it. She moved toward it through snow that came to her thighs in the open areas, breaking her own trail, using the crust to step on where it would hold her weight, sinking through it where it would not. The minister came into view first, struggling through the deep powder with the specific determination of a man who has been sustained past his physical capacity by the fact that he is carrying something he cannot set down. In his arms, wrapped in blankets that had frozen stiff on the outside and retained some residual warmth only at the center where they contacted the child's body, his son. 8 years old, slight for his age, his face flushed with the particular hectic color of a fever that had been climbing for 2 days, while the storm made the doctor inaccessible behind a drift packed hard as quarried stone against his door. Behind the minister, following in his broken trail, came Dorothea Vane. The composed, socially assured woman who had organized the autumn's parlor judgments was gone. In her place was a mother, the simplest, most essential version of herself, stripped of every auxiliary consideration by the fact that her child was burning while the world outside was 20 degrees below zero. She reached Rowena and stopped, her breath coming in labored white plumes, her eyes holding an expression that had no language left in it. Help him. 2 words, the space between them where the rest of her argument should have been occupied, instead by the visible effort of continuing to stand. She had come to the door she had spent the autumn teaching others to despise, expecting, at some level beneath her conscious desperation, to be turned away from it. This was the door of the woman whose name she had worked into cautionary tale format for months of sewing circles. She had come to it anyway, because the alternative was watching her child burn. Rowena did not make her wait for the answer. She took the boy from the minister's arms. Inside the chamber, she worked with the systematic calm of someone who has learned to keep her hands useful when her heart is not. She stripped the frozen blankets and replaced them with her own bedding, the quilt her mother had made, still carrying the warmth of her own body from the night before. She set water heating on the stove, feeding it the last of the wood scraps to bring the temperature up quickly. When the water was warm, she worked it past the boy's cracked lips, a spoonful at a time. The same patience she had used with Soot in December, not forcing, not rushing, letting the body receive what it was ready to receive. She laid damp cloth strips along his neck and the inside of his wrists, where the fever ran nearest the surface. She asked his name Thomas and used it repeatedly, quietly. calling him back from wherever the fever had sent him, the way you call a dog back from a long distance, without urgency, with the confidence that the call will eventually be received. Dorothea sat against the earthen wall with her husband beside her, both of them past the point where they could do anything useful, both of them doing the only thing left to do, which was to stay present while someone else solved the problem. The minister had his eyes closed. His lips moved without sound. The fever climbed through the afternoon. Rowena tracked it in the way she had learned to track all the important variables in her life, by watching what the body told her directly, without the intermediary of instruments she did not possess. The boy's color, the quality of his breathing, the specific temperature of his forehead under her palm versus the temperature of his hands and feet. The fever was working. The body was fighting. The room was holding its temperature. Late in the afternoon, the fever reached its crisis point. She could feel the difference, the moment when the body's defenses committed fully to the effort, and then, over the course of an hour that felt longer than any hour she had spent in the chamber, it broke. The hectic color drained slowly from the boy's face. His skin went from dry burning to the faint damp of a body that has relearned how to regulate itself. His breathing deepened. He slept, truly slept, the kind of sleep that heals rather than the kind that is merely unconsciousness in crisis. Dorothea Vane's composure broke in the moment she understood that her son was going to be all right. Not the theatrical breaking of a person performing grief, but the private, ungovernable collapse of someone who has been holding themselves together by main force for 2 days and has just been told they can stop. She wept with her face turned toward the earthen wall, her shoulders working with it, making no attempt at dignity, because dignity was not the thing she needed from this room. After a time, she turned back. Her face was wrecked by it, by the fear, the relief, the specific weight of arriving at this particular door in this particular condition after everything she had said in the autumn. "I said things," she began, her voice barely functional. "Things about you, to everyone who would listen, terrible things that Rowena's hand came down once on her shoulder, light as a question. Thomas will need you clear-headed when he wakes." The voice was even neither warm nor cold, offering no invitation to the accounting Dorothea needed to make, and no absolution from the need to eventually make it. Save the rest of it for a season when you have more room for it. The Pfeiffer family arrived before the Vanes had recovered enough to leave. Amos broke the trail through the deep snow himself, Ruth coming behind him with their 2 children, everyone moving with the reduced efficiency of people who have been cold for too long. Their stovepipe had caught fire on the second night of the storm, a buildup of creosote ignited by the sustained high burning they had been doing to keep the house habitable, and they had been forced to drown their own heat source with packed snow to save the structure, trading warmth for the roof above their heads, in the exchange that blizzards have always offered people who run out of other options. Amos stood in the entrance of the chamber and could not quite look at Rowena directly. Not from shame, exactly from the specific difficulty of facing a person you failed when you know they know you failed them, when no transaction of words has yet been made that would allow both parties to stand on the same ground again. The curtain he had dropped in October was between them as surely as if it were physical. She looked at him for a moment, not measuring, not punishing, just seeing, and then she stepped back from the entrance to make room. The family came in. She put a pot on and fed the fire with the last of what she had been saving, because the children were cold in a way that required immediate response rather than careful husbanding of resources. Others followed through the day. A farming family from the canyon's western end, a young couple married the previous spring who had been living in one of the older cabins, whose walls had never been adequate, but whose inadequacy had been survivable until now. Several men from the boarding house whose stove had finally given up the argument with the cold seeping through the green lumber walls. The chamber held 12 people at one point, pressed close on the earthen floor, warming themselves in a space that had been built to accommodate 1 woman and a dog. The bean soup she made from her stores filled the room with a smell of such uncomplicated abundance that 2 of the men from the boarding house sat for a long moment after receiving their bowls without eating, simply experiencing the smell as its own sufficient thing. That evening, when the children were settled and the women rested against the walls, Rowena took Amos deeper into the old tunnel, past the chamber, past the limit of the lantern's comfortable reach, to where the passage narrowed toward the working face that the original men had never brought to yield. She put the lantern in his hand. She told him to hold it steady, then to extend his other hand and press it flat against the rock wall. She watched his face. The change moved across it slowly, arriving the way cold truth always arrives gradually, through resistance, until there is too much of it to resist. He pressed his carpenter's hand against stone that should have been cold enough to ache, and was not. Stone that was merely cool in the specific way of things that have been insulated from both extremes, that have been protected from the sky's demands by 40 feet of mountain. It's warm. His whisper held the quality of a man encountering something his existing categories cannot accommodate. It's warmer back here than it is at the front. Geothermal heat, Rowena said. Then she gave him everything, in the order it needed to be given, the way Silas had given it to her across a supper table, without knowing he was handing her a life. Her husband had been a timberman at the Ironback. He had worked the deep levels, come home smelling of stone, brought back facts about the underground world, the way other men brought back wages. Below the frost line, the earth holds a steady temperature through every season, not because it is heated by anything above, but because it is insulated from everything above, sealed from the sky's moods by its own depth. 30 feet of earth stops the winter, 40 feet makes it irrelevant. She walked him through the 2 canvas doors, and the principle of trapped still air between them, the same principle that makes a double-paned window better than a single one, translated into a human-scale passage. She explained the pipe in the fissure, the importance of the upward grade in any tunnel that means to stay dry, the difference between a chamber that was found and one that was made, and why it mattered to look for what the rock offered before deciding what to build. She told him that the fire was a comfort and the earth was the foundation, and that a person who understood the difference could survive on the foundation alone when the comfort ran out. The ground is the stove, she said, finding the simplest form of it. You only need to be humble enough to come in out of the wind. Amos Pfeiffer, who built things with hands and understood things built with hands, did not hear this as metaphor. He heard it as specification. He turned it over in his mind with the evaluative intelligence of a craftsman receiving design, checking on it against what he knew about load and material and the physical laws that governed both, finding it not only plausible but elegant. He had climbed up to this chamber in the morning, seeing a desperate woman's irrational attachment to an impossible situation. He went back into the main chamber that evening, carrying the complete schematic of a system that could be replicated on any suitable hillside in the Colorado high country by anyone with the physical ability to dig and the willingness to understand what they were digging toward. The distance between those two perspectives applied to the same hole in the same hillside was the distance that would remake the canyon when the green months came. February brought the unraveling of the thing that had been wound tight since October. The snow was still deep, the cold still serious, but the character of it had changed. It was the cold of a season in decline rather than the cold of a season at its full power, and people who had lived through hard winters could feel the difference in it even when the thermometer said otherwise. A clerk from the district land office came up the canyon road one morning, arriving at Rowena's entrance with the specific manner of a man who has been carrying something uncomfortable in his chest for longer than he can justify continuing to carry it. He had been in the district office the previous autumn, when the Ironback Mines investigation files were processed following the collapse of the No. 3 shaft, and what he had read in those files had not sat quietly in him the way facts are supposed to sit. Amos brought the man up the slope and made the introduction and then remained, because he was the kind of man who understood that certain conversations required a witness. The investigation into the No. 3 shaft collapse, which had happened 2 months after Silas's death, in the same section of the mine, under the same general conditions, had been completed in November. The company had investigated because collapsed infrastructure cost money, and the company investigated things that cost it money with a thoroughness it did not apply to things that merely cost its workers their lives. What the investigation found, documented in the company's own records in its own accountant's careful hand, was a safety report filed 8 months before the collapse. The report recommended a complete reset of the timber sets in the lower third of that shaft, new posts, new caps, new lagging, the whole structural intervention that kept men alive in working tunnels. The report had been marked completed. The work had never been done. The cost of the work had been saved against the quarterly figures by the regional agent with the authority to order the labor and approve the expense. The regional agent was Gilbert Crane. The shaft that had killed Silas Marsh was the same shaft. The sets that had failed on the mornings Silas died were the same sets, the ones Crane had marked as reset in his ledger, the ones that had in fact been left as they were, because their replacement would have reduced his efficiency numbers for the quarter. Rowena listened to this without moving. When the clerk finished, she was quiet for a period long enough that both men in the room became uncertain about what came next. Then he killed Silas with a pen. Her voice was at a volume just above silence, stripped of everything except the precision of the observation. He put one line of ink on one piece of paper, and my husband went down into the earth, trusting that the people above him had done what they said they had done. He killed Silas with a pen, and then he came up the canyon road with his folio and his fine horse and tried to finish me with a stamp. Amos said nothing. The clerk said nothing. The chamber held its steady temperature around all of them, indifferent to the weight of what had just been spoken in it. She did not weep. The weeping had been done in October, alone in the dark, when the grief was new enough to be liquid. What she felt now, holding the complete truth in both hands at last, was the cold satisfaction of a debt finally accurately recorded. Not resolved, a man was still dead. The debt of that could not be resolved, but recorded correctly, with all the relevant entries in their proper columns. The folded papers in the tin canister in the wall had given her the ground beneath her feet. This new truth gave her the bedrock beneath that ground. The two together were heavier than anything Crane had ever carried in his leather folio. The news moved through Jasper Gulch the way water moves through a fault line, following the existing cracks, finding the places where pressure had already built, emerging at the surface sometimes violently and sometimes as a slow seep, but always moving. The families of the other men who had died in the Ironback since Crane's tenure started talking to one another in ways they had not talked before. Started asking questions about other reports, other sets of numbers that had been marked complete. Started asking about lawyers, which in a company town in 1889 was a revolutionary act dressed in the mundane clothes of a practical question. Crane's position with Stanton and Vale became untenable the moment the company calculated that defending him was more expensive than removing him. Companies perform this calculation with a speed and accuracy they rarely apply to anything involving the welfare of their employees, and this one was no exception. He was relieved of his position in March. His pension was voided. He was escorted to the road out of Jasper Gulch on a day when the first tentative signs of the thaw were visible in the changed quality of the light on the snow, and he went without the horse this time, without the folio, without any of the appointments of authority that had constituted his presence in the canyon. The man who left was measurably smaller than the man who had first ridden up the canyon road in October with his clean finger and his administrative grace. The punishment was not the maximum that justice in the abstract might have demanded. There were voices in Jasper Gulch that year who said clearly what they meant by that, whose grief had sharpened into a specific appetite. Amos asked Rowena directly. On a spring afternoon when the melt was running off the slope in thin musical threads, whether she wished for something harder, something that the law might have been made to provide. She looked at the fire for a moment before answering. "A rope ends a man in an afternoon," she said. "I would rather he carry the weight of it in his chest for whatever years he has left. A man who sleeps badly is a longer judgment than a man who doesn't sleep at all." The surveyor from Stanton and Vale arrived in May. On one of those Colorado afternoons when the sky above the peaks is a blue so absolute it seems to have been achieved through effort. He carried a document case rather than a folio. He climbed the slope carefully, in deference to boots that were not made for this terrain, and found Rowena outside doing the maintenance work that any shelter requires after a hard winter, checking the canvas, examining the rope attachments, assessing what the freeze-thaw cycles had done to the pipe seals. He was not carrying a notice of any kind. He was carrying a deed. In formal recognition of the service Rowena Marsh had rendered to the community of Jasper Gulch during the events of the previous winter, and in settlement of the questions raised by the survey discrepancies that had caused the company's attorney to decline the removal, proceeding Stanton and Vale Consolidated granted to Rowena Marsh clear title to the 4-acre parcel of ground containing her shelter. The prior claim of $1,879, which had clouded the company's title to the slope and made the eviction legally indefensible, was resolved in her favor as the sole party with an active and demonstrated stake in the land. The dispossession of the previous October was reversed, not by litigation, not by confrontation, not by any mechanism of official justice operating on its own initiative, by the accumulated weight of what she had done with the $12 and the dog and the warm seam in a worthless hillside, applied through the worst winter in 30 years until the evidence was too heavy for any ledger to balance against. She read the document twice, set it on the flat stone beside her stove, went back to work on the pipe seal she had been examining. The months that followed the grant of title were months of improvement carried out with the patience of someone who intends permanence. The canvas doors came down in early summer, replaced with fitted plank doors, 2 inches thick, hung on iron hinges, insulated with a layer of dried grass between the inner and outer boards in the manner of construction that Amos designed and built at cost because it was the specific thing he knew how to contribute. The earthen walls of the chamber received a lining of milled pine boards, smooth and fragrant, their resin still active enough to scent the air faintly even in winter. Amos built the hearth from fitted sandstone, mortared in place, a proper structure sized for a larger, more efficient stove that a hardware merchant in Delwood sold her at a price she suspected did not reflect his normal margin. Through the summer she had visitors almost daily, farmers from the lower valleys, homesteaders pushing into the high parks, ranchers who needed to protect breeding stock through the long killing months. Amos brought each one up the slope himself, at first because he thought introductions were needed, later because the path was well worn enough that people found it without guidance. She gave them everything she knew without reservation or ceremony, the way Silas had given it to her, as information, as fact, as the practical output of observation. The grade for drainage, the two-door principle, the importance of finding what the ground already offered before deciding what to impose upon it, the fire as supplement, the earth as foundation. Within 2 years, what the surrounding counties were beginning to call a marsh cellar, a deep, well-ventilated chamber cut into the south-facing slope of a suitable hillside, insulated by the earth's own constant temperature, rather than by any fuel-dependent system, had become a feature of the agricultural architecture across the high-altitude regions of western Colorado. It spread the way useful knowledge spreads when it is offered freely, faster than anyone intends, in directions no one fully tracks, carried by each person who receives it to the specific context where they need it, translated into the local materials available, modified by the intelligence of the people who use it. She declined every offer of formal recognition. A professor from the state university came up the slope one August afternoon with measuring instruments and a notebook, excited in the specific way of academic men who have discovered that something they find theoretically interesting has been practically implemented. He measured the chamber temperatures across the 4 seasons. He made drawings. He wrote a paper, eventually, using language that described her system in terms that would have been unrecognizable to her, and sent her a copy with a note asking whether she would consent to have the design formally attributed to her name. She wrote back in the steady, plain hand of a woman who had learned her letters late and never bothered with ornamentation. "The knowledge belongs to the mountain," she says. "I only listened to what my husband first heard in the dark, on the working levels where it was never winter. Put the mountain's name on it if you need a name." Dorothea Vane came up the slope for the first time in May, 6 weeks after Crane's departure, carrying a wrapped package of books she had decided she did not need to keep, and a way of holding herself that suggested she had been rehearsing an apology for some time. Rowena did not give her room for the rehearsed version, not from unkindness, but from the practical understanding that performed remorse, however sincere its origins, is a transaction that centers the remorseful person rather than the one who was wronged, and she had never had any appetite for being the occasion of someone else's moral accounting. She took the books. She offered coffee made from the good grounds she had been using. Since Bertie Oaks started including a small packet with the supply orders Rowena sent down to Delwood each month. She asked what was happening in the town. The conversation found its feet slowly, with the awkwardness of 2 people establishing the terms of a new arrangement, and it never fully lost that awkward quality, but it became regular. Fortnightly, then weekly through the summer. Dorothea brought news of the canyon, books she had finished, occasionally food she had cooked in the larger quantities of a household with more mouths than Rowena's. Rowena offered the specific kind of company that comes from a person who has learned to be alone without being lonely, present, attentive, not requiring the conversation to accomplish more than it accomplished. The thing that had begun in cruelty, that had hardened through the autumn into something systematic and comfortable for those who practiced it, softened through the following years into a friendship that neither woman would have predicted, and both came to depend on. It outlasted the minister's health. It outlasted Dorothea's composure about several other things entirely. It became one of those attachments that find their shape in opposition, like a plant that has grown through a fence and then become inseparable from it. Amos Pfeiffer never mentioned October. He showed up at the start of each winter with milled lumber for whatever repairs the previous year had required, and in the spring with food stores he characterized as surplus from the farm, which she accepted without comment because the fiction served both of them. Ruth Pfeiffer sent preserves. The children, as they grew, sometimes made the climb on their own to see the dog. There was a small cowardice between Amos and Rowena that they had both decided, separately, to leave in its place rather than excavate, because what had grown over it was more valuable than the clarity that excavation would provide. And both of them were practical enough to know the difference between a wound that needs opening and a wound that is better sealed. The succession of dogs continued. Soot lived 7 more years after his December fever. Good years, useful ones. The years of a dog who has found his purpose and inhabits it. When he died, he was on the hearth rug in front of the good stone fireplace that Amos had helped build, in a room that was warmer than any room either of them had experienced in the previous hard decade, and his passing was peaceful in the specific way that long lives end when they have been fully lived. She buried him on the slope above the entrance, in a place where the juniper roots would eventually find him. The dog that followed him was another brindle. Rowena had a preference, which she did not examine closely, for the coat pattern that recalled him. The second dog was followed by a third, each one carrying a version of the same companionship forward through the years, the specific warmth of a working animal that knows its person thoroughly, until the line of them stretched from 1888 to the early decades of the new century, like a single long loyalty, wearing out successive bodies. Rowena Marsh died in her sleep in the spring of 1933, in the bed she had moved into the chamber in 1890 and never saw any reason to move out of. She was 84 years old. The winter that preceded her death was an ordinary one by the standards she had established, which is to say it was brutal above the frost line and entirely irrelevant below it. She had outlived Jasper Gulch itself. The mine had played out in the 20s. The company had withdrawn its infrastructure. The families had relocated to better supplied ground. The buildings had been taken by the weather and the salvage operations, and finally by time, and she had outlived Stanton and Vale Consolidated, which had been absorbed, restructured, and dissolved by successive corporate arrangements that bore no resemblance to the original entity. She had outlived the system that had tried to schedule her death in the autumn of 1888, and she had done it quietly, in the Earth's company, without making more of it than it needed to be. Decades after her death, in the summer of 1974, a team of historical preservationists working through the collapsed mining camps of western Colorado followed as a local legend up a slope that had largely returned to its pre-settlement character, the juniper reclaiming the loose rock, the trail erased by decades of snowpack, the entrance visible only as a slight irregularity in the hillside that a person not looking for it would not register. They cleared the entrance with the careful methods of people who understand that what they are uncovering has been waiting in a specific state and should be allowed to arrive intact. They went in on an August afternoon when the temperature above ground stood at 87 degrees. The air that rose to meet them in the tunnel was cool, dry, carrying the specific mineral clarity of a sealed space that has been breathing to itself through a long silence. The plank doors that Amos Pfeiffer had built in the summer of 1889 still hung on their iron hinges, settled but functional. The fitted stone hearth held its mortared joints. The pine-board walls had dried and shrunk over the decades, but remained attached. The wood silvered now to the color of old iron. On the wall, still hanging from the nail she had driven into the old timber, set on the first night of her first blizzard, in that room the mercury thermometer, coated in the dust of 85 years. The glass intact. One of the team held a lantern to it. The mercury had settled to its natural position in the long darkness. The reading was unmistakable, 52 degrees. The number Silas had carried home from the deep levels of the Ironback mine on an ordinary evening in their first Colorado winter, set down on a supper table between a man who thought he was sharing a curiosity about his work and a woman who only half listened, neither of them understanding yet what kind of life the information was going to save. 52 degrees, in August, without a fire, without a person, without any of the human architecture of intention and need that had originally given the number its significance. The mountain kept it because that was what mountains do, not from loyalty, not from memory in any sense that requires a mind, but from the same patient physical consistency that had made it useful in the first place. The thermometer had simply waited in the dark for someone to come with a light and ask what it knew. It knew 52 degrees. It had always known 52 degrees. It would keep knowing it long after the lantern was put out and the preservationists went back down the slope to their century. The last and most wordless argument of a life, built from its hardest beginning to its quiet end, not on what the world had offered, which was very little, but on what one woman had been stubborn enough to find beneath the world's surface, where the cold had never once reached.